Now, making news this morning, there's breaking news out of Europe, and we've been dealing with it in the last hour. It appears as though German national Christian Bruckner has been charged with the murder or the disappearance of Madeleine McCann all those years ago in Portugal. So these reports have surfaced, but they've been confirmed by the Portuguese prosecutor. So that will make massive news right through the day. Obviously, it's night time in Europe. I reckon by the time we get the end of today and Europe wakes up in the morning, we'll find out just how big that story is and exactly what direction it's going in. There's also been this story on page 1 of the Australian today. Now, what's happened in the election campaign so far is that Anthony Albanese has absolutely given it to the government over its dealings with the Solomon Islands and has blamed the federal government for the fact China has been able to cozy up to them and give them assistance with their civil unrest and sign that cooperation deal. And we know what will happen next. China will want to put a base there. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It's not good for us that China's moving around the Pacific like that. We see it as sort of our territory, our domain to look after. All of a sudden, China's in there. Now, of course, Labor's only blamed the feds. And they've got a point, and I agree with Labor on this point. Marise Payne, our foreign minister, who tried to make an account of herself yesterday afternoon with Peter Pasoltis on Drive, she should have gone there. She hasn't gone to the Solomon Islands to try and sort this out. Now, she still wouldn't have sorted it out, but they've left themselves open to the attacks. Now, there's no doubt Australia, we've helped Solomon Islands over and over the years. But when China comes in with that weight of money, those local politicians, hello, you don't need to be Albert Einstein to work out what's happened there. So we still wouldn't have won out in the end. But the fact is, Labor has run these continual attacks saying that it was the coalition's problem and it was a foreign policy failure. Penny Wong's gone on the front foot. Well, Richard Marles, the deputy leader of the Labor Party, has been exposed in the Australian today by Sharri Markson, having in recent times basically said, who are we to get in China's way? And who are we to tell the Solomon Islands? If the Solomon Islands want to do with China, that's their right. And so then he's gone on the Today Show this morning. He was collared about this page 1 story in the Australian, and he said this, Richard Marles.
Well, it's a statement of fact, but the point here is this. Australia needs to earn the right to be the natural partner of choice. We are in a strategic contest with China, and we win in the Pacific, and we win that by earning the right to be the natural partner of choice.
So he's just going on about there being the natural partner of choice. I can tell you who aren't the natural partner of choice for the Solomon Islands. It's China. It's China. But I can tell you what they are. They're the financial partner of choice. Now, Richard Marles has said this today in light of the things that he'd said in recent times. And it's a problem because the leader, Anthony Albanese, is now stuck at home for 7 days because he's got COVID. And he's got this deputy leader out there basically undermining everything Labor's said this week about the coalition's failure. And he's there endorsing it. We also know Richard Marles went over to China in 2019 with that think tank. And Labor's trying to retrofit a lot of things here about a lot of its policies, particularly foreign policies. Labor hates Operation Sovereign Borders. They hate it to their core, but they have to support it because if they don't support it, they won't win the federal election, and they know it. They know it, that they have to support it, but they hate it. There's no doubt about it, they're a lot more sympathetic to China. I don't think they see the warning signs from China. We've been talking about China on this show for 2 years. I was talking about China on this show before it exploded in the way it has in the last 18 months. And I'll back myself to say that I was well ahead of the curve on it. Senator James Paterson is the chair of the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security for the federal government. He's on the line. Good morning, Senator Paterson.
Good morning, Neil.
These comments by Richard Marles that have been shown and exposed by the Australian today, and then him basically backing them in on the Today Show today, quite serious stuff, really.
Incredibly serious, Neil. That's exactly right. And the Labor Party has very serious questions to answer today about the very obvious contradiction between what Richard Marles has been saying for years, including in a speech in China, in Beijing, where he welcomed China's involvement in the Pacific, and their current policy, which they say is just as strong and just as supportive of the government as the Liberal Party is. Well, I think the record is clear that, in fact, the Labor Party has consistently had weak positions on China, and these revelations are just more evidence of it.
Yeah, very weak positions. Some of those things he said. So he said this, Richard Marles, in recent months. The idea that Pacific nations would adhere to a call from Australia to not engage with China is silly. So that was one of the main things that he's quoted as saying in recent times. And we know that in 2019, he took a trip to Beijing funded by the controversial think tank China Matters, which has now been stripped of its Australian government funding over concerns about its agenda. And he went on those trips and he said several things like, let me be crystal clear. This is China being involved in providing assistance in the Pacific. Let me be crystal clear. That was and has been a good thing. The Pacific needs help, and Australia needs to welcome any country willing to provide it. Certainly the Pacific Island countries themselves do. Australia should never welcome China getting involved in that way in the Pacific, just the same as they wouldn't pretty much welcome it, Senator James Paterson, if you guys lobbed up to Taiwan and said, hey, we're going to put some troops here.
Well, Neil, I think that's a good point, and I think it's really instructive that Richard Marles says one thing when he's in China and something different when he's in Australia. And the interesting thing about that speech he gave in China is it never appeared on his website. In fact, the only place you can go and read that speech today is on my website because I found it and I put it up. What was Richard Marles trying to hide? Why did he never publicise that on his website? And why does he say one thing when he's in Beijing and a different thing when he's in Australia? I think it reflects very poorly on them and their credentials on national security. And in an uncertain time, can we really risk as a country a weak Labor government? I don't think so.
I think their former Senator Sam Dastyari fell on his sword for the same thing, didn't he?
That's right. In fact, Sam Dastyari was articulating the Chinese government's position at a press conference next to a Chinese political donor instead of the Labor Party's position on an issue. And Richard Marles has been advocating what appears to be a position very contradictory to the Labor Party's stated current policy when he was in China on that trip funded by a Chinese-friendly think tank.
Senator Paterson, could I also get your take? There's this other story today. It's also in the Australian, so it's got a couple of them today, where Xi Jinping has said some rather provocative stuff. He's basically taking the Russian line, saying it's a new kind of theory about defending your country, and it allows you to spread out in and around your region willy-nilly. And it's the same defence chart that Russia used to go into the Ukraine. This language from Xi Jinping just kind of keeps upping the rhetoric.
It does, and it's exactly what our Prime Minister has been warning about for some time when he talks about the risk of rising autocracies and the fact that they're working more closely together than ever before. In that same speech, Xi Jinping fairly plainly outlined his ambition to dismantle the United States alliance network in the Indo-Pacific, and that would be enormously detrimental to our interests. And we know that the Chinese government has changed its posture to the region in the last 5 years. The militarisation of the South China Sea, the takeover of Hong Kong, the threats towards Taiwan. We're in very serious times, Neil, and that requires a government that's got strong plans for national security, that invests in defence. And we know that Labor's record here is very poor. They slashed defence spending when they were last in government to the lowest levels we've seen since 1938. And I have no confidence that they wouldn't do the same thing again.
We're at a point of no return, though, aren't we, with China? Unless Xi Jinping falls off the perch.
I think the situation we're in with China is going to be the case for some years to come. I think the economic coercion they've launched against our country, the threats they're making to the region, the interference and espionage they've engaged in our country, which the ASIO Director General has said is at the highest levels that we've seen since the end of the Cold War. These are things that are not going away anytime soon. And so what that requires from Australia is strength. It requires very serious military capability. It requires us to be very clear about our intent, and that's what this government has delivered.
Senator James Paterson, one thing that is for certain, the coalition government has spent a fortune upping our defence capabilities. But at the same time, we've got to be able to have a bit of a laugh when it comes to politics. So to the break, and I'm going to leave you listening as well. I'm going to play you, Senator, I'm going to play you Bob Katter on Q&A last night, where he took the government to task. Look, we basically should sit back and just enjoy it for what it is. Senator Paterson, thanks for your time. Here's Katter.
In 4.5 years, Keith, you haven't built a rifle, you haven't built a machine gun, you've stupidly built patrol boats that have got one machine gun on them. Oh, geez, that'll terrify the Chinese having that machine gun on those patrol boats.
That's actually not a fact.
$60 million for a patrol boat that has a machine gun on it. It should have had 40 missiles on it. It's a hell of a patrol. If you are serious about China, and look, I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that I'm wrong.
Yeah, we all hope he's wrong. The Keith he's talking to there was Keith Pitt. Anyway, 8 after 8.
Traffic. Join John Stanley for nights, Monday to Thursday.